My daughter-in-law laughed as she slid a $4,850 luxury mall bill toward me, and her mother smiled like I was their personal automated teller machine. For 6 months, I kept paying to keep the peace, but this time I smiled back and said 5 words that wiped the smile right off her face. Funny, I forgot mine, too. Have you ever felt like family only calls when they need money? Drop a yes in the comments and tell me what time it is, where you are. I'm reading every story tonight. The silence in the boutique was absolute. A dead air you only find in places where money is usually the loudest thing in the room. The cashier looked from the digital screen, showing a $4,850 total, to me, then back to Ashley. Her hand, still resting on that silver tray, looked like a claw. Her mother, Susan, actually blinked 3 times, her mouth hanging open just enough to show she'd forgotten to breathe. The oops routine had finally hit a brick wall. "What do you mean you forgot it, Diane?" Ashley whispered. Her voice had lost every trace of that influencer sweetness she used for her followers. It was sharp, cold, and edged with a desperate kind of panic. "You never forget anything. You're a forensic accountant. You're the most organized person I know." I didn't feel the rush of guilt they were expecting. Instead, I felt a strange, clinical clarity. I looked at the piles of silk, the leather shoes, and the limited edition coat they'd picked out without asking me a single question. "I suppose even the most organized people have their off days, Ashley," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "Since Susan has her purse in the car, I'm sure the 2 of you can figure it out." I actually have a luncheon to attend in 20 minutes, so I'll leave you to it." I didn't wait for an answer. I adjusted my coat, turned my back on them, and walked away. The sound of my heels on the marble floor was the only thing I let myself hear. Stepping out into the waterfront terrace district, the autumn air felt different. It was crisp, clean, and entirely free of the scent of expensive desperation. For months, I'd been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill for a lifestyle they hadn't earned. My compassion had been a luxury they'd overdrafted for years, and as I walked toward my car, I felt the account closing. My phone began to scream for attention before I even reached the parking garage. Tyler, always the cleanup crew. I didn't answer. I watched the screen glow with his name as I pulled out of the district and headed toward the suburbs. He called 3 times in 10 minutes. On the 4th, I pressed the button on my steering wheel. "Mom, what on earth is going on?" Tyler's voice was strained, the sound of a man watching his carefully constructed house of cards begin to lean. "Ashley is hysterical. She said you abandoned her and her mother at the register in front of everyone. She said you made it look like they couldn't pay." "They couldn't pay, Tyler," I replied. "That isn't a performance. It's a fact. I didn't have my card, and I had a previous engagement. I'm sure they managed." "They had to put almost everything back, Mom. Ashley had to call Susan's husband to wire money just to get the shoes. She's never been so humiliated." "Humiliation is a choice, Tyler. If you buy things you can't afford, the risk of embarrassment is part of the transaction." I pulled into the driveway of the sanctuary. The dark wood of my Victorian home stood firm against the gray sky. This house was built on decades of 80-hour work weeks and meticulous planning. It wasn't a bank, it was my legacy. I hung up before he could pivot to the guilt trip portion of his script. I wasn't interested in being the hero of their story anymore. I was busy writing my own. I sat in my wingback chair, the silence of my home settling around me like a heavy velvet curtain. I didn't turn on the lights. Instead, I let the shadows of the Victorian molding stretch across the floor while I did what I do best. I calculated. My mind was no longer a mother's mind. It was an auditor's. I began mentally scrolling through the ledger of the last 3 years. The numbers didn't lie, and they certainly didn't care about family loyalty. Over the last 36 months, I had leaked $120,000 into Tyler and Ashley's lives. That isn't an estimate. It is a verified total. I saw the $50,000 for the down payment on their condo. I saw the $18,000 for the designer wedding dress Ashley claimed she couldn't live without. Then there were the microloans that never found their way back to my account, $500 for a car emergency, $2,000 for a medical surprise, and countless grocery bills that I'd covered because they were having a rough month. I realized then that I had fallen for the most dangerous fallacy in the world, the sunk cost of motherhood. I kept investing more, hoping that the next check would finally be the one that bought their maturity. But as I sat in the darkness of the sanctuary, I understood that my generosity hadn't been a bridge to their independence. It had been a poison. I had been de-skilling my own son, stripping away his need to struggle, to save, or to value the weight of a dollar. I wasn't his safety net. I was his handicap. A memory surfaced, sharp and unbidden. Tyler at 17, standing in this very kitchen after he'd backed my car into a stone pillar. He hadn't asked if I was okay or apologized for the damage. He had simply looked at the crumpled metal and asked when the insurance check would arrive so he could get the sport rims he'd been eyeing. Even then, he didn't see my hard work or my stress. He saw my policy limits. I had laughed it off back then as teenage immaturity. But now, at 33, the pattern was identical. The stakes had just grown 5 digits larger. My compassion had become a resource they were strip mining. Love is supposed to be a partnership of mutual respect, but for them, it had become a subscription service, and they just assumed I would never cancel. My help was actually funding a theatrical production of success that they couldn't afford to stage. They were playing at being high society influencers while I worked the behind-the-scenes shifts to keep the lights on. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a flicker of maternal regret, but there was only a cold, clinical clarity. This wasn't a breakdown of our relationship. It was a balance sheet that finally had to be reconciled. I wasn't going to let them liquidate my retirement to pay for their vanity for another minute. I stood up and walked toward my office. I didn't need a hug, and I didn't need an apology. I needed my laptop. It was time to stop being a mother and start being an auditor. I needed to see exactly how deep the rot went. The notification started at 7 o'clock the next morning. My tablet on the nightstand didn't just buzz. It felt like it was hyperventilating under the weight of incoming data. I didn't reach for it with trembling hands. I sat up, adjusted my pillows, and picked it up with the same steady grip I used to handle multi-million-dollar corporate audits. Ashley was live. The notification said heartbroken and holding on. I tapped the screen. There she was, sitting in her perfectly lit kitchen, a single, carefully placed tear tracking down her cheek through a soft glow filter. She was wearing a cashmere sweater I'd bought her last Christmas. "I never thought I'd be sharing this part of my journey," she whispered to her 12,000 followers. "But so many of you are going through the same thing with your aging parents. Yesterday at the mall, things got scary. Diane, my mother-in-law, just wasn't herself. She was confused, erratic, and she even forgot who was supposed to be paying for her items. It's devastating to see such a sharp mind start to fade. We're doing everything we can to get her the care she needs." The comments were scrolling by like a digital landslide. "Sending prayers," one said. "Dementia is so hard, you're so brave for taking this on," said another. I watched her nod at the camera, her eyes shifting to check her engagement metrics, even as she pretended to wipe away more grief. This wasn't a family reaching out in concern. This was a calculated smear campaign. She was using my reputation as the foundation for her next sponsorship deal. She was rebranding my independence as confusion, and my refusal to be robbed as a mental decline. Then came the text from Tyler. It arrived exactly 3 minutes after Ashley ended her stream. "Mom, I hope you saw the support people are giving us. We can't ignore what happened yesterday. Ashley and I have been talking, and for your own safety, we think it's time to discuss a temporary power of attorney. We need to make sure your assets are protected since you're clearly having trouble managing things lately. Let's not make this a public scene. Just come over today and let's sign the papers." I sat there in the quiet morning light, the blue glow of the screen reflected in my reading glasses. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. I recognized the strategy immediately. In the corporate world, this is called a hostile takeover. You devalue the target, create a narrative of instability, and then move in to save the assets. They weren't worried about my memory. They were worried about the fact that the automated teller machine had finally developed a conscience. They thought they were playing with a lonely widow who would be frightened into compliance by a few thousand strangers on the internet. They forgot that I spent 30 years finding people who were much better at hiding their tracks than a failing lifestyle influencer and a middle management son. I didn't reply to Tyler. I didn't comment on the video. I simply opened my secure cloud storage and began a new folder. I titled it Asset Protection and Counter Strategy. The gaslighting was over. The audit had officially begun. I walked into my home office and closed the door with a click that sounded like a vault ceiling shut. The room smelled of old paper and the faint ozone of high-end computer equipment. For 30 years, this room had been my cockpit. I had dismantled offshore accounts and traced missing millions for firms that didn't take no for an answer. My son and his wife thought I was just a grandmother with a hobby. They had completely forgotten that I was a hunter with a spreadsheet. I sat down and initiated what I call the red flag protocol. This isn't just about looking at a bank statement. It's about analyzing the velocity of money and the digital footprint of a lie. I logged into my professional-grade credit monitoring software and began the deep dive. The first discrepancy surfaced within seconds. It was a collection of buy now, pay later accounts, Afterpay, and Klarna, all registered to my home address using my social security number under Ashley's email. It was a classic case of identity fraud. She was hijacking my high credit score and residential stability to fund a lifestyle of $400 hair extensions and designer handbags she couldn't afford. Then I moved to Tyler's emergency card. He told me it was for gas and groceries during his rough month. The audit showed a very different reality. There were recurring charges for high-end coffee subscriptions, premium car washes, and even a $1,200 charge at a luxury golf resort 3 weeks ago. He wasn't struggling to survive. He was just unwilling to pay for his own luxuries, while my hospitality was available for the taking. He had transitioned from a son into a parasite, and he'd done it under the guise of family loyalty. In my profession, we study the fraud triangle: pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. It's a social rule that explains why people steal. Ashley felt the pressure to look wealthy, to maintain her failing brand. I had provided the opportunity by being too kind to check the books for 6 months, and they had both rationalized it by telling themselves that since I was a widow and secure, I didn't need the money anyway. They viewed my hard-earned peace as a resource to be harvested. The audit further revealed that Ashley's brand was currently $60,000 in debt. She wasn't an influencer, she was a sinking ship, and she was trying to use my Victorian estate as a life raft. That explained the dementia narrative she was pushing online. If they could get me declared incompetent, they could move in, liquidate the house, clear her debts, and keep their social standing intact. They were looking at me and seeing a real estate transaction, not a mother. I didn't hesitate. My hands were cold and precise as I began clicking. First, Tyler's emergency card was permanently deactivated. Next, I logged into my cellular account. Tyler had been on my family plan since his college days, another remnant of my good mother persona that I had never bothered to change. I removed his line and authorized the immediate suspension of his service. No more grace periods. I wasn't being cruel, I was being accurate. If Tyler wanted to be a 33-year-old man who stood by his wife's lies, he could finally do it on his own dime. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the sound of a balance sheet finally returning to zero. I didn't stop at the bank accounts. A true forensic audit requires looking at the physical perimeter as well. I pulled up the archive for my home security system, the high-definition cameras I'd had installed after my husband passed away. I began scrubbing through the footage from 4 days ago, back when I was at the local farmer's market for 3 hours. The screen showed a silver sedan pulling into my driveway. Susan, Ashley's mother, stepped out. She didn't knock. She pulled a spare key from her designer purse, a key I had given to Tyler for absolute emergencies, and let herself in. She stayed for exactly 15 minutes. When she walked out, she was smiling a thin, triumphant smile that made my skin crawl. Tucked under her arm was a thick bundle of my mail, the bank alerts and credit notifications I'd been wondering about for weeks. Susan hadn't just visited. She had been systematically intercepting my reality to keep me in the dark. I stood up and walked into the living room, heading straight for the ornate Victorian bookshelf that housed my husband's first edition collection. I didn't have to look long. Tucked behind a volume of Shakespeare was a small, matte black cylinder no larger than a button. A spy camera. It was positioned perfectly to capture the armchair where I usually sat to read. I didn't smash it. I didn't even move it. I went back to my office and accessed my home network logs. The camera was broadcasting to a private cloud server. Using a simple packet sniffer, I traced the destination. I didn't just trace it. I hijacked the feed, replacing my live video with a pre-recorded loop of me napping in my chair. They would be watching a ghost while the real hunter went to work. I even disabled the camera's internal microphone, so while they thought they were listening to my confusion, all they were actually getting was a silent, empty feed. It led me directly to a password-protected folder on a popular content hosting site. Because Ashley had once used my guest computer to check her analytics and never fully logged out of her browser's keychain, I was in within 2 minutes. What I found wasn't just a collection of videos, it was a business plan. A pitch deck titled The Long Goodbye, Monetizing the Matriarch. The first slide featured a photo of me, edited to look pale and exhausted. The proposal was for a reality-style vlog series, It detailed how they would capture my moments of confusion and use them to secure sponsorships from high-end assisted living facilities and pharmaceutical brands. One slide explicitly mentioned the liquidation of the Victorian estate to fund a multi-generational smart home for Tyler and Ashley. They weren't just waiting for me to get old, they were manufacturing my decline to steal the equity in my home. They had even drafted a script for the day of intervention, the day they would force me to sign the house over to them to protect me from my own mistakes. I felt a coldness settle in my bones that had nothing to do with the weather. This wasn't just greed. This was predatory fraud. They were trying to erase my personhood to pay off Ashley's credit card debt. My son, the boy I had tucked in and cheered for at every graduation, was a co-conspirator in a plot to turn his mother's life into a sponsored tragedy. I downloaded every file, every video of me sitting quietly in my own home, unaware I was being used as a prop for their dementia narrative. I saved the security footage of Susan's unauthorized entry. I mapped out the unauthorized buy now, pay later accounts. I had enough evidence to bury them in a dozen different courtrooms. I looked at the 3 brass keys on my desk. They were the only things in this house that hadn't been compromised. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I simply typed one message to Tyler and Ashley. I've reviewed your proposal for my future. We need to talk. My house? Sunday at noon. Bring Susan. The trap was set. They thought they were coming to a surrender. They were actually coming to an execution. The front door of the sanctuary didn't just open. It practically rattled on its hinges as Tyler, Ashley, and Susan marched into my living room. They arrived with the coordinated stride of people coming to collect a debt. Ashley was holding a heavy leather binder, her face scrubbed of its internet sobbing filter and replaced with a look of predatory concern. Tyler hovered behind her, his eyes darting around the room as if he were already measuring the windows for new drapes. "Mom, we're so glad you're ready to be rational," Tyler began, his voice dripping with manufactured pity. Ashley didn't wait for an invitation. She slammed the binder down on my mahogany coffee table and flipped it open to a spreadsheet. "We've done the heavy lifting for you, Diane. Given your recent episodes at the mall and your clear confusion regarding finances, we've mapped out the transition. We move in on the 1st of the month. We'll rent out our townhouse to cover the property taxes here, and you'll move into the guest suite. It's for the best. You need the supervision." I sat perfectly still in my armchair, the one where they had hidden the spy camera. I let them speak for exactly 3 minutes. I watched Susan nod like a rhythmic vulture as Ashley pointed to the master bedroom on the floor plan, which was already labeled with her and Tyler's names. They talked about me as if I were a piece of furniture that needed to be reupholstered and moved to a smaller room. When Ashley paused to take a breath, I didn't argue. I simply turned my laptop screen toward them. "You've been very busy with your binder, Ashley," I said, my voice as cold and flat as a winter lake. "And your claim about renting out your townhouse to pay my taxes is a delusion. I pulled the public records this morning. You've missed 3 mortgage payments, and the bank has already issued a notice of default. You aren't moving in to care for me. You're looking for a place to hide before the sheriff evicts you." But my audit was much more thorough. The color drained from her face as the first file appeared on the screen, a high-definition screen grab of her pitch deck titled "Monetizing the Matriarch." I clicked to the next slide, showing the $12,000 in unauthorized buy now, pay later accounts she'd opened in my name. Then, I played the video of Susan hiding the spy camera in my bookshelf. The room went dead silent. The predatory concern in Ashley's eyes shattered into pure, unadulterated terror. Tyler stepped back, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "Mom, we were just trying to document your condition," he stuttered. I laughed, a sharp, clinical sound. "The irony, Tyler, is that by pushing a public narrative of my dementia, you made that power of attorney you're holding legally void. A person without capacity cannot sign legal documents. You were so blinded by greed, you forgot the most basic rule of the law." "My condition is perfectly fine, Tyler," I replied, standing up with a deliberate, lethal grace. "But your legal standing in this house is terminal. In this state, identity theft involving a senior citizen is a felony that carries a mandatory prison sentence. I've already provided the district attorney with your digital footprint and the Social Security fraud evidence. I've already filed fraud reports for every single unauthorized account. I've sent the footage of Susan's breaking and entering to my attorney. And as for your family care plan, I've already executed one of my own." I walked to the front door and held it open. The autumn wind rushed in, cold and unforgiving. "Your items are in the cardboard boxes currently sitting on the curb. Tyler, Your phone line is disconnected. Your emergency card is a piece of dead plastic. And the locksmith left an hour ago. Every exterior lock on this property has been changed. Ashley tried to summon one last burst of indignant rage. You can't do this. We're family. You're being incredibly vindictive over a simple misunderstanding at the mall. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked her directly in the eye and delivered the final blow. I'm not being vindictive, Ashley. I'm not even angry. I'm just an adult who pays for her own things and manages her own space. I'm not forgetful. I just finally remembered who I am. I watched them stumble out onto the porch, Susan clutching her empty binder as if it could save her. I closed the heavy oak door and turned the new brass deadbolt. The click was the most satisfying sound I had heard in 30 years. It has been 3 months since that Sunday afternoon, and the silence in my house has changed. It no longer feels like the empty space left behind by my husband. It feels like a protective shield. I spent years worrying that being a good mother meant being a boundless resource, but I've learned that a well with no bottom eventually runs dry. Tyler still comes over, but things are different now. He visits alone on Thursday evenings. These visits are a form of strict, supervised probation. He is currently working double shifts at a distribution center to pay back every cent of the $120,000 he drained from my accounts. He knows that a single mention of money, or one more excuse for Ashley, will result in his permanent removal from my life and my will. We sit on the porch, drink coffee, and talk about his actual life, not his curated influencer image. He doesn't ask for money, and I don't offer any. He seems more grounded, perhaps, because he is finally having to carry his own weight without my quiet subsidies. He told me last week that he and Ashley are in marriage counseling and living in a modest one-bedroom apartment. I didn't offer to pay for the therapist. I just listened. Looking back, I realized my biggest mistake wasn't walking away at the luxury boutique. It was letting things get to that point in the first place. I had allowed my desire for peace to blind me to the fact that I was being systematically erased in my own home. I was a line item in someone else's business plan. I've come to realize that boundaries aren't walls built to keep people out permanently. They are simply gates with secure keys. And as the sole owner of my life, I am the only one who decides who gets a key and who has to knock. True family love doesn't demand your financial submission, and it certainly doesn't require you to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. If you find yourself in a similar situation, feeling like your kindness is being treated as a weakness, remember that no is a complete sentence. You aren't being cruel by protecting your peace, you are being honest. It takes an incredible amount of courage to audit your own heart and realize when a relationship has become a liability. But the freedom that comes from reclaiming your sovereignty is absolutely priceless. I sit in my living room tonight, surrounded by the things I chose, funded by the life I built. My life isn't grand or filled with dramatic victories. It is quiet, orderly, and entirely mine. I finally have my peace back, and that is worth more than any designer handbag in the world. If this story reminded you that your peace is worth protecting, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Let's build a community of people who respect their own limits and hold their own keys. Thank you for listening to my story. Sleep well, knowing that you are the architect of your own sanctuary.